Republican motherhood was a notion that women should serve as educators of young men in order to influence them to become productive American citizens. Since the Revolutionary era, the influence of women in society has continued to evolve. Over the last century, women's service to her country has rooted itself in women becoming an integral part of the American military, cementing the Republican motherhood ideals proposed during the country's inception. On May 13, 1908, the first women to serve in the U.S. Navy were nurses, also known as the Sacred 20. Secretary Joseph Daniels needed additional workers after learning that the civil service could not meet the need for clerical support. Since the Naval Reserve Act of 1916, any U.S. citizen can join, including women. A young lady by the name of Loretta Perfectus Walsh from Pennsylvania enlisted herself as the first woman to forever change to the U.S. Navy. More than 11,000 women joined her, working in the naval districts across the U.S. In 1942, America was losing the war to Japan, who dug into the Aleutian Chain and all islands big and small in the Pacific Ocean. Our manpower was stretched to the max, with no end in sight. So all four branches of the service were open to women who had been trained to do every single task the men were doing except active combat roles. Even though the Navy waves never saw a gun, their influence was significant.
It was 78 years ago today when Navy installations were hit with the tsunami of waves. Not the watery kind, but women accepted in volunteer emergency service. On July 30th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed Public Law 689 allowing women to enlist in the newly formed U.S. Naval Reserves. To say it was a success is an understatement. This newly created branch of the U.S. Navy, the women accepted in volunteer emergency service, had changed America's armed forces for the better by challenging gender norms in the military service and beyond. These powerful women taking pride in wearing their uniform has forever changed the social order of the military and began the process of breaking down the gender barriers in the armed services. Women performed many jobs that broke the female stereotype of just being relegated to the kitchen. The wave's influence on today's society and the military have resulted in the women obtaining officer positions as well as serving in active combat roles. Not only did the waves influence today's society, but it also challenged the gender norms of both men and women in the military.
The military was known as a man's world until the women were needed to fulfill the non-combat roles. Former Navy wave by the name of Peggy Lutz served from 1944 to 1946 as a control tower operator. She states, "The men were put off by our appearances on their scene because it usually meant that they would be replaced by us and would have to go into combat, which was the basic principle of our existence." Women joining the armed forces were subjected to stereotypes, but Peggy states, "In general, the public accorded us to special respect once they realized we were not taking their husbands and sweethearts away in the dark of night. Most of us were very decent about respecting married sailors or officers. We paid attention to what we were in the service for, and that was to win the war." Women broke this stereotype by joining the military by their boot camp training in leadership, self-confidence, and pride being an American. Although the stereotype of women in the military at the time was generally considered by the public to be temporary, it changed on June 12, 1948. President Harry Truman signed Public Law 625, the Women Armed Services Integration Act, which approved regular and reserve component status for women in the military and disbanded the waves. Although the waves diminished the traditional housewife role, they needed to look the part.
Many women did not know what the duration of World War II was going to be. During a phone call interview with Peggy Lutz, she states,
"For the duration and 6 months, which meant that we didn't have any idea nobody did what the duration was going to be. And so we almost all of us, sold all of our clothes, or we gave them away. We cleaned out our wardrobes. This is going to go 2 or 3 years. They did predict that it would be a few years. And we all did the same thing, and I had a pretty good wardrobe because I was teaching school already. So I had to look pretty professional every day. Well, I gave all my clothes away. Well, ho-ho, about a year later, here comes the advice that we're going to be separated we're going to be discharged. And 6 months later, all of us women, 350,000 of us got discharged. Well, there was a bit of a problem replacing some of the clothes for whatever duty we wanted to go to. And yeah, there were some funny things like that just a lot of people don't know about, and they're kind of the sidebars.
The Navy's uniform today cannot nearly compare to the waves due to being the first step of equality. Peggy Lutz says, "It had no special significance other than being my choice. No one else in my family had ever been in the military. I wore the uniform proudly, feeling security and trusting the Navy to always have my back." It took 2 weeks for the women to get their tailored uniforms by the designer label Main Boucher. Until then, they wore their uniform hat with a blue crown and brim, civilian clothes, and GI issue shoes. For $200, recruits received 2 blue suits, 3 long-sleeve navy blue shirts, 2 white shirts, and a navy top coat. There were many adjustments for all involved, but women were here to work.
Women, now part of the Navy, are performing vital jobs everywhere. They work side by side with men, sharing the same responsibilities, earning the same pay, and now looking forward to the same advances. From Peggy Lutz's time in the service as a control tower operator, she wrote an autobiography, Never Salute with a Broken Garter, with the following experts saying, "On a moonless night fall, the midnight hour in 1945, the U.S. had settled differences with the Japanese off to the west. The Naval Air Base was in blackout conditions dusk till dawn. In the tower terms, blackout meant that anyone approaching the field after dark could not expect a single ray of sunlight from any window, not even a flashlight. And for those reasons, many control tower operators never logged anyone after dark who didn't belong to the U.S., except for the night of Jig 13. My time in the tower, my understanding of a pilot in total distress, my knowledge of human nature was called upon in my choice of action. I could not violate tower protocol. I could not respond to my empathy for the lost pilot. Pilots were taught that flying a plane under any circumstance has only mature judgment plus mechanics involved. He cannot fly a plane on empathy or sympathy, but both this pilot knew that he was minutes away by death in the crash. The blackness of night, he only had my words to rely on. The wave's requirements were considerable strength, citizenship, at least 18 years of age, and at least 2 years of high school, and 5 feet in height. The specific jobs were aviation, communication, science, medicine, and technology. Many women became so proficient at their jobs that one of them could replace 2 sailors for combat duty, and Peggy's words, "If they were not threatened by us, they would find a way to keep us subverted. And male in charge of promotions would give preference on upgrade, better duty, and scheduled time off to other males first. Enlisted males did not like taking orders from female Navy officers, but they had no choice."
Waves have influenced today's military by obtaining enlisted and women officers to work side by side with men in all areas except for combat. The waves have shown time and time again that women have broken barriers within themselves. In Peggy's words, all 350,000 waves who went into the service between 1942 and 1946 slid in under the glass ceiling without a welcome, but knowing they were needed. So they nudged the door open and held it until more and more women kicked it open, wide enough to shatter the glass ceiling. As Peggy would say, "I am a proud pioneer of the U.S. Navy."